Good afternoon or good morning, depending on what time you're waking up to watch this video. This is our ongoing series of conversations with communication exemplars. And we have the opportunity to spend time visiting with Yvonne Chotzen today. And Yvonne is an incredibly interesting person. And she's going to share a little bit more about her background in a minute. But from an academic standpoint, what we're doing is presenting to you some different ways of thinking about persuasion. So as you're reading the text, as you're looking at the lecture notes, as you're looking at the slides, there's a number of theories around persuasion. And when I met Yvonne, I was thinking this is a natural to tie into this part of our course, bringing storytelling into how managers can establish a rational approach towards who they are, can have an emotional connection to who they are, and are going to be better equipped to deal with folks in the workplace. So Yvonne, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here, Jerry.
Since you're going to be sharing with us how we go about becoming better storytellers and the importance of storytelling, I'd like you to start with your story, not pre-birth, but your evolution, because one of the things that is fascinating to me and a number of the guests we've had in have had to reinvent themselves as they've gone through life. They went in one direction and then either life or themselves caused them to take a turn, and then they had to reinvent themselves to be successful before they got to where they are today. So let's start with your evolution.
Lots of reinvention. I'm the oldest of 8 brothers and sisters, and storytelling was a tool that I learned because I think every night my dad told us stories. And so when I found myself as a young litigator in the courtroom as a federal assistant public defender for the United States, I was up against these burly prosecutors who were huge in build and very deep in voice.
Right.
And the courtrooms, the federal courtrooms, and at least in the district where I was practicing, are very, very large, high ceilings, lots of echo and reverberation.
Right.
So I found that if I used the quietest of voice,
You're getting me to lean in, right? Yeah.
but told a story that was compelling about my client, that it completely captivated the jury. So I used that tool that I'd used to keep kids quiet or to put them to bed. As the oldest, I had to do a lot of babysitting because of what my father had given us. And so as each job progressed to the next, I found different ways to use it. I got a very high acquittal rate as a public defender, I think because the juries felt when you tell a personal story, it's not about myself, but about the person who was the defendant, they feel connected.
Outstanding. And you went from the field of law, which was a lot of preparation, a lot of dedication to get through law school and to practice, into a whole other realm, which intrigues me. What was that big move?
That was the fact that I was practicing law in the District of Hawaii. So when cases were argued on appeal, you had to go to a bigger jurisdiction. And so I found myself in a courtroom in Los Angeles arguing the appeal of a very fascinating murder case, a triangle love affair. It took place on Kaneohe Air Marine Corps. It had all kinds of conspiracies in it.
Oh, wow.
Fascinating case. And as I was arguing the case, of course you have to focus on the judge very intently and your opposing prosecutor. I continually heard the door behind me, that sound, as people poured into the courtroom. And so as soon as the break came, I turned my head and was astounded to see that the entire courtroom was packed, not with lawyers, but with movie producers who wanted the rights to my client's story. And on the break, it quickly occurred to me that the part of trial work and litigating that I loved was those moments in front of the jury when I got to tell stories, not the 7 to 10 weeks before when I was slaving till past midnight in the law library.
Right.
And so I turned to my client, and before the United States Marshals came and handcuffed her and took her back down to the lockup, which is in the basement of every courthouse, I had her give me her rights on a paper napkin.
Wow.
And so as those producers crowded around me, I had her rights. And within less than a week and a half, I had taken her story with one of the producers and was pitching it to NBC. And everything in life is timing. It became one of NBC's highest rated miniseries in the prior 5 years, and my phone did not stop ringing off the hook. And so a new career ensued, which was that of a television movie producer. And it was heaven for me because I got to tell stories all the time.
And you're paid for it.
I was paid.
Right,
That's what
right.
pitching is.
Right.
And we had a great run. My husband joined me. We started a production company, and we got 8 or 10 movies made in less than a decade, which is almost unheard of in Hollywood. It's quite the town of nepotism.
Right.
But what we learned was that if you have the property they want, then you're golden. And that property was great stories. So I went back to my friends at the FBI and the CIA and all the different agencies. Even a movie was based on a story that came from the Fish and Wildlife Service.
How do you make drama out of it? That's pretty
poaching.
cool. Yeah.
It was a poaching story.
Okay.
So I got all these rights, and I came back with, over 100 stories and started pitching them all over town, and that's how we set up all the movies. And was blessed one day to have the opportunity to pitch directly to Mrs. Rosa Parks and her team.
Wow.
And many, I would say 400 different producers were trying to get those rights. And how did we prevail? We told a very simple story about how and what we would do if she gave the rights to us.
Right.
And not to diverge, but we were able to be blessed to get those rights, made the movie, and the rest is history. How can you make crime of the week stories after you've made the story of Mrs. Parks?
Right.
And that revelation came at the same time that there was a writer's strike in Hollywood. And I thought, what is it that I love to do?
Right.
Storytelling, whether in the courtroom or teaching people to pitch or pitching myself. And I love teaching others to find their stories. So thus was born a new company.
Fantastic. That is fantastic. If we can go back to Rosa Parks, there's something that comes across in our conversation, and I'd really like the students to understand this concept. And it's the concept of authenticity and personal character in how you communicate that. And my sense is that Rosa Parks just didn't call you and said, I'd like you to do her story. There had to be something about the way you approach that communicated that sense of authenticity and personal character.
That's completely true, Jerry. In fact, we were turned down because they were being besieged by the biggest production houses in Hollywood. And when we flew into Detroit to get our meeting, we finally were granted a 10-minute window based on a letter that I wrote. And in that letter, what I did was I went to the library and I got Mrs. Rosa Parks' children's book. It's her story. And it starts out, I, Rosa Macaulay, was born in Pine Level, Alabama in 1911. And I read that children's book and I thought, I can see the movie here. I can tell the story from the perspective that she wrote it.
Right.
And that's what I told her I would do in the movie. And I told her something that turned out to be very, very important to her, which is that I made the promise that for the rest of my life, whenever asked, I would show her film to children.
Wow.
I just came this morning from showing it to an 8th grade at a school, an auditorium filled with young people.
Fantastic.
So I will always do that and can be reached, and I'm happy to do that whenever. And what I learned also was that the production companies had told her, oh, we don't think a woman sitting on a bus and refusing to give up her seat is enough of a movie. So I hope you understand, Mrs. Parks, that we will be adding some dramatic material. And that was offensive to her,
Absolutely.
and I can certainly see why.
Right.
Because when that moment comes in the movie, and again, I just screened it for kids today, when she is asked by James Blake, the character of the bus driver, are you going to give me that seat? And there's a white man standing there, and she says, no, I will not. And he says, if you don't get up, I'm going to call the police. And she takes a breath, and you can see her, you can see the fear, and you can see her calm herself. And she says, you may do that. And that moment incites what we know became the end of segregation, not only in the South, but in our whole country, that moment.
I love that piece, and from a student standpoint, I hope they're getting the message that you did not allow yourself to be defined by your competition, by the big studios.
And I did not allow myself to be stopped by my emotion, because I'll tell you the truth, it was just so breathtaking for me to be in her presence that when she was surrounded by people who she had selected that were deeply trusted friends and assistants to her, and they were peppering me with questions. And when they asked, why should we give you the rights? All I could think of to say was, your story is just so powerful for me. It's affected my whole life, which is true. I grew up in an integrated neighborhood and went to 98% black schools in Seattle. And I said, for the rest of my life, as I told you, I will tell your story. And then the tears rolled down my face. And I could not stop them. And as I was being ushered out, the helicopter from one of the big studios was landing in her yard with 16 executives, and they were rolling out a huge, portable screen to show their fabulous last movie that was a box office hit. And I, walked to the waiting taxi. So I think the contrast was meaningful for her, because she's been a person herself who was so often on the outs.
And the other point of that story that I made a note to myself was, there's an absolute appropriate time to have emotion as part of your message. And the other piece that struck me is your ability to really understand the audience that you're communicating with. That you weren't talking to a script, you weren't talking to a character, you were talking to a real person that had expectations, and you were able to prepare ahead of time to do that. But then you also allowed your intuition to come in and help you make the right connection too. There are just so many levels of that story that are absolutely outstanding. The other thing that popped into my mind is there's a book out now called Quiet, and it tells her story about how she was such a positive, quiet counterpoint to Martin Luther King, and that if you want a cause to move forward or an organization to move forward, it's that combination of quiet people and bigger than life personalities that can make things happen. So that's outstanding. On a technical side, one of the things we're trying to do is, in this chapter on persuasion, is to help create trustworthiness, that to be persuasive, you have to be competent in your message. You have to be dynamic in how you come across, and you have to be objective in a way that it's an honest thing. You're not selling something; you're selling what goes on. How does that tie into the storytelling process?
Very much so. I think that there's two ways that I would suggest to people to approach how you find your story. One is think very, very carefully about your audience. If it's a job interview, know everything you can about the job, about the budget, read about the company. Mm-hmm. If it's a pitch and you're a startup, know everything you can about the board or the investors that you're pitching to. Do your homework on the audience, because you never know when a spontaneous, impromptu question will come. And the fact that you know that somebody, one of the investors, is passionate about something that you can tip your presentation to. So the first thing is absolutely, in every regard, know your audience. Mm-hmm. And of course, the second thing is know the outcome that you want for your message. If your goal is to get a job, if your goal is to have them invest in you, if your goal is, whatever your goal is, if you're selling tiddlywinks, mm-hmm. know everything about your product. Be prepared for those questions that could completely come out of left field. Mm-hmm. If why don't, you're telling us to buy these tiddlywinks, what would be the difference if we bought them instead from Shanghai, where they have a tiddlywink factory? Right. So do your homework in that regard. So that's step one, is look at your audience carefully and look at the objective for your pitch. Mm-hmm. I would say step three is look at the storytelling methodology. And that methodology is very simple. It comes from Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. Okay. Every great story across every culture in history has the same formulaic basis, which is that you have a protagonist or a hero. In most cases, that will be you if it's your personal story. Right. But it could be someone who inspires you, like Mrs. Parks, or it could be somebody from a business example. So you have a protagonist who has an obstacle. As my son said, Mom, why don't you just tell a story that someone goes to the bank? And I said, honey, if you go to the bank and you take out your money and you go home, is that a story that's compelling? No. But if you go to the bank and the teller's about to take out the money for you and the man behind you takes out a gun,
yeah, right.
We have an obstacle.
Yes.
To you getting your money, right. To you getting out of there safely, to the teller getting out of there safely, to how are they going to catch that person with the gun. Yep. You create as big an obstacle as you can, and then the challenge is how do you overcome the obstacle to have a positive outcome. So the steps are a protagonist or character mm-hmm. that we feel passion for, committed about. If that's yourself, then the passion is there. We believe in ourselves. An obstacle to overcome. How is that obstacle overcome? That's where the bulk of your story is, even right. if it's 2 or 3 minutes long. How is that obstacle overcome? Mm-hmm. And then a positive result. Now, the biggest question of all is how do we tell that story? How do we find those stories that are going to move the audience and right. communicate our message?
And do you have any ideas on how we find that story?
Yes.
you teed that up because I wanted to know, all right, how do I do this? Yeah.
You do it with your left side of your brain. You do it from your heart, your emotion, and your intuition. And what I suggest is that if you're in a group, for example, if you're doing this exercise in class, then there's sort of an electricity in the air. But even if you're doing it at home, at your desk by yourself, this is what I suggest. First, get quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of the book Quiet.
Right.
And for some of us, that means formal meditation. For some, that means, take a walk with your dog. However you get quiet. No media, no noise, no distractions. And have a blank piece of paper in front of you. And then you're going to do an exercise that in our training we call fast write. And really it's stream of consciousness writing. It's the antithesis of how you will ultimately deliver your presentation. This, be very clear, is how you find the stories in you. Because all of us, if we've lived any time at all in the world, and if we're watching this video, have so many powerful stories inside us. So write down first, what is a crisis that I or someone close to me, someone I admire, or a business scenario overcame with a positive result? And then go to that quiet place, and then don't censor yourself. Just start writing. I would say do it for 10 minutes the first time. And write down at least, try for 5, but if you at least get 3 to pour out of you, 3 different instances. And I have numerous examples, but some of them that have come up in our training are, one person remembered sweating on the top of the high dive when he was 14. Everyone at the beach would line up to jump off the high dive.
Right.
But every time he got up there, he'd get to the end of the board and just could not jump.
Right.
And of course, overcoming that obstacle for him, that leap through space, on the 16th try, I think he was finally able to do it.
Wow.
And you can imagine the humiliation of each time going at the high dive and having all the kids waiting for their turn going, will you get down or jump? And so for him, that was the story that was the breakthrough in his life. And he shapes that story and tells it over and over as he has climbed the ranks of management. Because for him, that's an example of how he overcame a great emotional hurdle. And he can't tell that story without getting emotional.
Oh, wow.
So that's just an example. Find something in your life.
Oh, we spent time talking about developing my personal story, or for the students to work on their personal stories. Does this same model work for organizations?
Absolutely. Let me share a business model story that would work very well. And this is a story of a man named Ray Kroc, who at 51 years old, after he'd sold milkshake mixers for 17 years, learned that a competing company was going to take over his company's line of milkshake mixers because they had a superior mixer. And he was down and out, very distraught. He had a wife and kids, and his way of getting business was to drive from place to place and try to sell these mixers. Right. And even though he was from the Midwest, he noticed that there was a company, one family-owned restaurant up in San Bernardino, and they didn't order 1 milkshake mixer at a time, nor 2, nor 3. Every year they ordered 4. And so he said, as my last drive on this route selling milkshake mixers, I'm going to go see that restaurant. What is their secret? So he drives to San Bernardino in his beat-up station wagon, and he sees this family restaurant where people are lining up to eat. It's immaculate inside. Right. It's beautiful and clean, and he has the inspiration of his life. He's going to approach the 3 brothers and buy the restaurant. Of course, they want nothing to do with him.
Who's this peddler coming in here, right? Yeah.
They're very happy in San Bernardino, and the restaurant's very successful. So he doesn't give up and makes them a proposal. He finds out that the brothers there's three of them, that they're very risk adverse. So he constructs a story for them about the fact that he will build some identical restaurants. Of course, now in retrospect, we know this is the beginning of franchising. And he will take all the risk of the construction, raising the money, getting the people trained, and they will get 90% of all the profit from these restaurants. And so they finally, after his persistence and passion, go along with it. And what we later learn, of course, is this is the beginning of Ray Kroc's McDonald's empire. And what he had to do was take his story first to the brothers, who were risk adverse, then to the investors, and he had to actually sell this idea of a family restaurant with affordable food that was sparkling clean. And then he had to sell the story again to the franchisees, and then he had to sell the story to the American public. And so he had 4 different stories for each audience. Every audience could feel his passion. The story's the same, but you shape it for each audience. So when you think about an organization, he built one and he used story.
All right, you convinced me. I have one comment to close out, and then I'll let you defend yourself. For the whole semester, I've been teaching structure, how to organize letters, how to organize memos, how to organize, slideshows in a very, very structured way. And now you're coming in saying, well, stream of consciousness isn't all bad. Go with the flow, get in touch with your feelings. How do I reconcile these two when the students are saying, well, Yvonne said?
When you sit down and look at your audience and your objective, you want a story that's going to touch that audience and that comes from your passion and from your life. But you don't have those stories accessible in your right brain logical side. Those stories are in your subconscious. Those stories are in your intuition side. So when I say to give yourself 10 minutes to do stream of consciousness writing about different times in your life when you remember overcoming an obstacle, when you remember a breakthrough in your life, or when you remember somebody else doing that deeply inspires you, those are your stories. But they come from that well of intuition on the other side of your brain. Then you pick the story as you look at your list that most fits your business objective and your audience, and you start shaping that. So after you pick that story and start honing it and add vivid details, then you use your right brain. But to elicit that story and have it come up from the depths of your life, you use the stream of consciousness.
Excellent. Well, I'm absolutely convinced now. You persuaded me within 30 minutes. Considering I'm half Norwegian and very stubborn, that's a major accomplishment. The other piece that I absolutely enjoy and I want the students to take away from our time together is our students are very special, that their life has not necessarily been easy, and that when they come into business, don't close the door on those life's experiences, that when you come in to be interviewed or you're lucky enough to become a manager, you're encouraging them, as I'm hearing, to take the time to develop their story and share it.
Absolutely. It will move your team. It will move your interviewers. You will touch people because your authenticity shines through and connects you to the people you tell your stories to.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Jerry.
Take care.